A senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's joining us from Philadelphia. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. I want to talk to you about Donald Trump's threats with regard to Iran's energy facilities in the event that the Strait of Hormuz is not opened. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that Trump does not have a lot of arrows in his quiver except to escalate, to de-escalate in his mind. In other words, to impose more costs on Iran, to raise the pain, to try to get Iran to make a deal, to open the Strait of Hormuz. And that's because if you don't get a deal, it's very difficult to open that strait. It's narrow, it's shallow. The Iranians can mine it. They can send out speedboats from the coast. They can launch missiles from the high ground along the coast. And so I think, at least for now, the U.S. is continuing to believe that it can get a deal. And what's left in terms of targets, going away from the military targets that Israel and the United States have been hitting, toward bridges, which we saw a couple of days ago, toward energy facilities, toward perhaps water facilities, in a way of trying effectively to cause such domestic pain and dislocation that the Iranian government says it's time to cut a deal and end the fighting.
Does the nature of this particular threat that he's issued tell us anything about any sense of urgency he might be feeling in terms of trying to bring this war to an end?
I think Donald Trump feels considerable urgency, and that's because this is not a popular war in the United States. I would say that at the beginning of the war, a majority of Americans were not on board, and that has shifted even more decisively against the war since it began about 5 weeks ago. Most American allies are not on board with the war. And very importantly, and perhaps crucially, this is a war that, even though is not affecting the flow of oil to the United States per se, we live in a world in which the market for oil is globalized. And as a consequence, we Americans are now paying $4+ a gallon when we fill up the car. We're seeing energy prices go up, electricity prices go up, fertilizer, food. And as a consequence, this is taking a toll on not just Donald Trump's popularity, but the Republican Party's popularity, with the midterms looming not that far away. And so I do think that Donald Trump feels some time pressure to try to up the ante militarily, in the hope that that will then end the war diplomatically within the next 2, 3, 4 weeks.
Now, I was reading an article that you wrote on the Council on Foreign Relations website, and you were saying that there were 3 possible options, that outcomes for the end of the war. One, of course, was on the battlefield. The second one was diplomacy. There was one that I wanted to ask you about, and I may be paraphrasing slightly what you were marking as point 3. How possible is it, do you think, that Donald Trump, given the timelines that we've just been discussing and the pressure that he might be feeling, could simply decide that the US has been victorious, however he chooses to define that, and he might just walk away, leaving a fragmented but vengeful Iran in charge of the Strait of Hormuz, and possibly still with some missiles?
That's a real possibility. Then we have something that would look more like a frozen conflict, perhaps not unlike what we see with Ukraine and Russia, where the battlefield is quieter than it used to be. The front line doesn't move much, but there, at least as of yet, is no peace deal. And Donald Trump could say, we've hit the missiles, we've hit the drones, we've hit command and control, we've taken out the leadership, mission accomplished. I'm now handing this problem over to the Europeans and the Japanese and the Koreans and the Gulf neighbors that are more dependent upon Gulf oil than we Americans are. But, and this is an important but, I'm not sure that he can do that. Because if you don't get some kind of understanding with Iran, then the strait remains closed. And if the strait remains closed, or at least at the will of Iran's decision-making on whether to shoot at tankers, to shoot at cargo ships, then the impact of this war on the global economy doesn't abate. And that is something that I think Trump has to keep front and center. So I do think that, at least for now, the goal here is not just to do more damage to Iran, but to do more damage to Iran with the goal of convincing the Iranians to sit down at the negotiating table and end this war with some kind of peace settlement that represents common ground and an opening of the strait.
Donald Trump, as we've just been discussing, is threatening to hit civilian energy sites. We know that both Israel and the US have hit civilian sites, such as the bridge, for example, in Iran as well. That's regarded as a war crime under the Geneva Convention. Now, for its part, of course, Iran has been firing cluster munitions into Israel, particularly. They too are banned under the Geneva Convention. Is there any circumstance now where the so-called rules of war can be said to apply anymore?
You know, the rules of war are still out there. I wish that we lived in a world where countries abided by them, but we are also in a moment in history in which geopolitical competition is heating up, in which great power rivalry, which was in abeyance 2-3 decades ago, seems to be coming back with a vengeance. And under those circumstances, I think you're going to see countries perhaps try to abide by international law, at least rhetorically, but feel that they need to cross the line when it comes to fulfilling national interest and fulfilling strategic missions. So listen, the laws of war are quite clear. You cannot target non-combatants. You can't go after civilians. If the United States does begin to target civilian infrastructure, does begin to impose costs upon the average people who can't get food, can't get water, can't get electricity, then obviously we're in a very ambiguous place when it comes to whether this is a war that is abiding by the international law and norms that are out there.
Really appreciate you taking the time and giving us the benefit of your expertise in this. Charles Kupchan, thank you very much indeed, sir.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.